I'm going to speak on Ethiopia. Let me begin by saying that in addition to the challenges of Ethiopia, the President will be speaking at the Africa Union, and that is in fact one of the main reasons, I think, for going to Ethiopia. There's an interest in increasing African governance, increasing Africa's commitment to regional security. The Africa Union is a very weak organization, but yet has taken on some of the most difficult challenges, and while imperfect, it is the show. And so I think that is a worthy objective of a presidential trip. And clearly, if he's in Addis Ababa, he's going to have bilateral meetings with the government there. And that is a much more difficult, in my mind at least, balancing act. Not unsimilar, or at least some of the echoes of the challenges in Kenya also apply to Ethiopia. But let me get to my main points. I'm going to make a couple of points of the context for U.S. policy, and then a few more particular points. So this is really the first couple of points are just for me to articulate what I think U.S. policy towards Ethiopia has been of late. If you listen to policymakers, they often talk about policy towards Ethiopia as a three-pronged policy or a three-legged stool that consists of support for economic growth and poverty alleviation, support for security, the security relationship that the U.S. has with Ethiopia, and then an assertion that the third leg of this stool is support for democracy, human rights, and media freedom. I'll get to that, of course, in a minute. And these three prongs are, of course, in tension. In some ways, that's not surprising. Not all good things go together, and so it's a mixed message. It's a complicated message. I heard a senior U.S. official when I was talking about the authoritarian nature of the EPRDF responded, yes, but it's a friendly authoritarian state. And that kind of phrase gets to this kind of tension, that there are things to say about Ethiopia that you would say about a friend, and simultaneously there are things to say about Ethiopia that you would say about an authoritarian state. And these things are not, they're in tension, but they can coexist together. Let me go through the first couple of two legs, and then rather a little more on the democracy and human rights, and allow my colleagues here and those of you in the room who know so much to speak. I think there has been genuine change at a grassroots level with regard to poverty in Ethiopia. I would urge the President or anybody thinking about Ethiopia to look at the kind of village-level health clinic, regional university kinds of contributions that have been made, and less so on the kind of high modernism of huge dams and trains and so on. I think the real difference is coming at a real micro level, and there's a long way to go. It's very early days of a huge developmental challenge, but there are some things there that deserve support and deserve a recognition. There's some challenges on the economic side. In particular, I think there's some challenges on the questions of, I'll call land leases. A lot of other people would call them land grabs, but that land is being leased to multinational corporations in a way that the most marginalized populations typically do not benefit justly in the rewards of those projects. On the security front, there's two prongs of that as well. There's a counterterrorism piece, and then there's a peacekeeping piece. The U.S. does have counterterrorism interests in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia has interests in counterterrorism in the Horn of Africa. I'm not at all certain they're always the same interests. They both have concerns, often concerns about the same groups, but for very different reasons and with very different histories and with very different desired endpoints. And I think the U.S. ought to be clear on where Ethiopia is doing things in its own interest, and we see that as advancing our interests, and when Ethiopia is doing things in its interests that are not serving our interests, and so on. This particularly relates to Eritrea and Somalia. Say another word about that, but in one of my concluding points to ask the question on counterterrorism policy, are these policies creating more or less instability and, in the long term? Are they serving U.S. interests or not in the long term? The other part of that security relationship, though, that I think is has to be included is the question on peacekeeping and Ethiopia's support for multilateral peacekeeping operations. The U.S. has been very, very happy with that Ethiopia has provided troops on some of the difficult peacekeeping operations in Sudan and Darfur and South Sudan, Abyei, and that in many ways those troops are not easily replaced. I won't say they're irreplaceable, but it would be very difficult to get troops in a state of readiness and with the capabilities that Ethiopian troops have. All right. If that was all there was to the story, in some ways it would be a much easier trip. But Ethiopia, this third leg of the stool, relates to questions of democracy, human rights, and media freedom. I can speak at length about why what a strong authoritarian ruling party, the EPRDF, the ruling party, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, is. The fact that they won 100% of the seats in the May elections, that's not. How much more than 100% do you need to know? It's a pretty clear indication of just how powerful they are. They're also, until recently, Africa's largest jailer of journalists, and there's really been a process ever since the 2005 elections, competitive elections, that I think frightened or at least alarmed the EPRDF. There's been an ongoing process of criminalizing dissent, that if you are trying to articulate an alternative to the party, that is being treated as treason, that's being treated as in league with terrorists, that's being treated as illegitimate, anti-constitutional, anti-people, as they sometimes use the language in Ethiopia. And that is part of this very, very strong authoritarian system. And in that way, U.S. relations with Ethiopia, rather than Kenya perhaps, more resemble relations with other geostrategically important states that have troublesome records on democracy and human rights from the U.S. point of view. Countries like Egypt, countries like Pakistan, countries where two things are going that are in tension with each other, and therefore the United States often struggles to come up with the message when in fact there's two different things that they want to articulate. And so that will be President Obama's challenge. To say simultaneously, we're very happy with some of the development advances. We really appreciate your support for peacekeeping in Abyei and in South Sudan negotiations, but we have deep, deep concerns about the almost complete elimination of political space, the arrests of journalists, the harassment of opposition parties, and the restrictions on civil society. Maybe just make sure, since I don't leave this off the record, that people think I'm not making the point, that Ethiopia has put in laws that really restrict, have the intention and have had the effect of basically eliminating the ability of Ethiopian civil society organizations to work on democratization, human rights, even things like women's rights, children's rights, the rights of disabled peoples. And that is extremely problematic in a state as large and as complicated as Ethiopia. And it's also used the counterterrorism law to really restrict media. I'd be happy to speak more, and my colleagues may want to fill in some of those details. Now, that's the kind of context of the policy. The two, although I almost always will come up with three, but the two main points that I want to give that are a little bit more trying to synthesize is one is on the question of U.S. leverage over Ethiopia, and then the second is about short-term versus long-term security. U.S. government officials often will say that they have very limited leverage over Ethiopia. After all, a lot of our aid budget is tied to things like HIV/AIDS or humanitarian assistance, and so we can't really threaten to cut off that money in order to accomplish to apply pressure on a government as fiercely proud and resistant of international pressure as the Ethiopian government has been. And there's something to that. But I think the point that comes up in the context of this trip is that this trip is leverage. This trip is something the Ethiopians really, really wanted. wanted. And while the U.S. might want to say, no, it's not a seal of approval, it's part of discussions with a state, like we have discussions with all kinds of state, look at the Ethiopian government's webpage during the time of the trip. Look at what was going to lead the local news. Look what the embassy is going to say. This is a big, big deal to Ethiopia. And therefore, to me, the question is, how has that leverage been used in ways that can advance U.S. interests on democracy and human rights? And I think, at least to date, the answer hasn't been much to show for it. There have been some journalists who've been released, and I'm very, very happy to see that. One might well say in the same breath, if I can not breathe long enough, but that these journalists never should have been arrested. So freeing these journalists doesn't get you a gold star. It just means that you have now taken that step. I understand these journalists, by the way, have not been given back their passports. So even as they've been released, it's a kind of a restricted ability to play their important role as independent journalists. What I would think is the much more kind of structural changes that ought to be on the agenda, where this leverage of this trip ought to be used, is one, while the journalists are important, they are important and they're important as individual stories, as people who some of us know, but that the real structural power issue, what's much more important, is the conviction of the Ethiopian Muslim leadership that took place earlier this month. That is a big, big deal. That is an important movement. That is where the Ethiopian government is in real tension with a significant portion of its community, and it really, I think, tells yet another story about how authoritarianism works in Ethiopia. I also think that, to get back to the laws that I mentioned, what would really matter, where you'd see real evidence of the use of this leverage, is on things like the CSO law, this regulation of NGOs. If that was changed, if that was removed, I'd say, okay, the U.S. is really getting something for its leverage. Or if the anti-terrorism law or counterterrorism law was changed in a way that it wasn't applied so broadly that it's very difficult for independent journalists to do their work. And so I would be very happy, and we'll look to see if the U.S. government, if President Obama is able to raise these issues that I think are much more than the symbolic issues, but really get at the heart of why there is such limited political space in Ethiopia. The second and final, until I think of a third, issue has to do with this question: are we building our relationships in the Horn of Africa around an assumption regarding Ethiopia's likely stability and Ethiopia's role as a stabilizing force in the region that needs to be questioned? In other words, if the answer to, well, we have to have the strong, friendly relationship with Ethiopia because it is essential for stability in the region, is that necessarily true? Is it true in the long term? What happens to this regime 5, 10, 15 years out? And what might the U.S. be doing now to prepare for that? How is Ethiopia, in fact, playing roles that may destabilize in Somalia, in Eritrea, and potentially elsewhere in the region? I was very taken with Ambassador Bellamy's reminder of the U.S. legacy of working on pro-democracy NGO development in Kenya at a time when it wasn't welcomed, when it was controversial, where the government didn't thank us for that, but yet the payoffs that you see down the road. And I don't think that kind of logic or that type of concern for working with building long-term relationships with the key political leaders of the future has been made. Let me also, on this question of relationships, maybe just end with one final point to make sure that some of you, I know, are journalists who will be going on this trip or who follow relationships. The Ethiopian government has made some really quite astonishing bellicose statements about Eritrea recently that really are laying the groundwork for what could be an escalation of that conflict, the Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict, and that it would be very useful for the United States and for President Obama to say directly to the highest level officials, we are not on board with you on that, that crossing the border into Eritrea would be a catastrophe and you shouldn't do it, to make sure that there's no, was it a yellow light or a green light or a red light, but no ambiguity on that point. Let me leave it there because I know we have so many questions and wisdom in the room, and on my other panelists, and thank you very much.